Ghostface mask is very important to the message it presents to the audience because the mask shows emotion. The mask isn't blank and expressionless like the Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees masks. The Ghostface mask has personality to it. It's an obvious expression reflecting the fright of its victims, and therefore mocking its victims who scream in terror when confronted by Ghostface. But the mocking of the victims goes even further than the physical mask. You have to ask, why are they being mocked? Is it just for superficial reasons? Or is it something deeper? What message is the movie sending by having the victims mocked? You have to investigate why Ghostface chooses his victims. He doesn't just randomly appear and kill anyone around him. The characters he attacks do one specific thing, with a connection symbolic to the central theme. And to discover this, I want to discuss in detail Randy's first rule about sex and how it applies subtextually to certain characters and what that message means to the audience.
More of a game, really. Can you handle that, Blondie?
Let's begin chronologically with Scream's infamous opening scene. Without question, this is the best opening scene in any horror movie in my opinion. The sequels have tried to emulate the uniqueness in the original's opening scene, but have failed.
It was a simple game, Cotton. You should have told me where Sydney was.
The first scene sets the stage for Scream's sexual promiscuity theme. Casey Becker, played by the great Drew Barrymore, during her phone call with an unknown person we'll soon know as the killer, decides to encourage his hopes of a conversation with her by flirting with him. Rather than being firm with the caller and telling him to leave her alone, she speaks with him about popcorn and horror movies.
What's that noise?
Popcorn.
You making popcorn?
Uh-huh.
You have to have a favorite. What comes to mind?
Halloween. Nightmare on Elm Street.
Is that the one where the guy had knives for fingers?
Yeah, Freddy Krueger.
This opens the door for the caller to ask her on a date, to which she even slightly entertains.
Do you have a boyfriend?
No.
She obviously has no allegiance to her boyfriend that she denies having. All someone has to do is simply flirt with Casey, even just over the phone, and it's implied that she'll be unfaithful. Whether she was really going to cheat on her boyfriend or not is irrelevant. It's the possible betrayal to her boyfriend that dooms her. Immediately after she lies about not having a boyfriend, Ghostface asks for her name and then tells her,
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
This line changes the entire complexion of the scene. It goes from a simple and innocent conversation about horror movies and flirtation to a moment of stalking. Ghostface is there to test Casey's allegiance to her boyfriend and then apply his deadly wrath to her. Casey does in fact have a boyfriend, Steve, yet she was open to cheating on him. But as we'll soon find out, is that Casey's suggestion of sexual promiscuity didn't begin with a phone call with Ghostface. She has a history of it. Casey was easy to entice. All Ghostface had to do was entertain her with a little conversation before getting her to say that she didn't have a boyfriend. This implies that her relationship with her boyfriend wasn't that strong, and maybe that's because Casey and Steve's relationship had begun as an affair. Randy even suggests that Casey dumped Stu for Steve. Stu denies this, saying he dumped her.
Hey, Stu, didn't you used to date Casey?
Yeah, for like 2 seconds, before she dumped him for Steve.
But I don't think so. If Stu dumped Casey for Tatum, then why kill her? The revenge aspect wouldn't apply then. It only makes sense if Casey dumped Stu for Steve, and then Stu got revenge by killing Casey and the guy she left him for. So there was likely infidelity during Casey and Stu's relationship.
The Exorcist was on. Got me thinking of you.
It did?
Yeah. It was edited for TV, you know, all the good stuff was cut out.
We first see Sydney typing away at her computer, likely finishing up a paper for her English class. She later mentions that Casey Becker sat next to her in her English class, so it makes sense that she's doing homework with its connection to Casey. Sydney is diligent and focused, thinking long term as seen by taking her studies seriously. In that way, Sydney reflects another final girl, Laurie Strode from Halloween.
I forgot my chemistry book. Costain wrote that fate was somehow related only to religion.
Billy Loomis creeps through Sydney's open window, reminiscent of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Johnny Depp's character Glenn does the same to Nancy.
I'm sorry, I saw your light was on. I thought I'd see how you were.
You know, sometimes I wish you didn't live right across the street.
Whereas Glenn and Nancy certainly had an ongoing romantic relationship, it's implied that whatever relationship Billy and Sydney had was broken off, likely happening after the death of her mother a year prior.
I want my girlfriend back.
Billy immediately begins his goal to have sex with Sidney by comparing an edited version of The Exorcist he had seen on TV with Sidney's lack of desire to have sex with him. He's basically manipulating her into having sex with him. She'll eventually succumb to his coaxing during Stu's party, and for now, Sidney decides to have a little action, but no sex. Billy was dead set on getting Sidney to lose her virginity with him that night. The anniversary of her mother's death is coming up, and Billy wants to have sex with Sidney before he kills her on the 1-year anniversary. Billy's going to kill Sidney whether she has sex with him or not, because of Sidney's mother having an affair with his father and breaking up his family. Plus, Stu just officially restarted the murders that same night with the killing of Casey and Steve, so Billy is under pressure to get Sidney to lose her virginity with him before he kills her.
No, I'm not trying to rush you at all. I was only half serious.
Billy wants to destroy Sidney's family. It's revenge for Billy.
Your slut mother was fucking my father, and she's the reason my mom moved out and abandoned me.
Sidney is a girl of honor and respect. She keeps her virginity during this scene, showing that she isn't fully susceptible to the sexual promiscuity theme, unlike Casey Becker, who flirted that she was open to being unfaithful to her boyfriend. However, Sidney shows she could possibly be persuaded to be sexually promiscuous when she flashes Billy before he leaves. Sidney may not be active concerning sexual intercourse, but she certainly toes the line. Billy knows this, and that's why he doesn't stop throughout the film to guilt-trip her for not having sex with him. They probably would have had sex already, but Billy didn't account for Sidney's grief to be so strong that it blocked their sexual future. He hopes that if he's persistent, she'll eventually have sex with him, and she does. When Sidney goes to speak with the police about Casey and Steve's murder, she's greeted by Principal Himbry, Sheriff Burke, and Dewey.
That's Deputy Riley today.
They're all familiar with Sidney and the ordeal she and her father went through last year with the murder of her mother. It's important to note there's a moment of suspicion here towards Principal Himbry, played by the iconic Henry Winkler, aka the Fonz from Happy Days.
We're all gonna be like 3 little Fonzies here. Come on, Yolanda, what's Fonzie like?
Cool.
What?
Cool.
Correctamundo.
The principal touches Sidney's face before they begin. The sheriff and Dewey both notice this. It's a quick moment, but they both express suspicion.
The police just want to ask you a few questions. You okay?
Sidney, were you very close to Casey Becker?
It adds to the mystery that the principal might be the killer, or at least involved in the murders. Also, it's the way the camera stays on the principal for just a second too long that gives the audience the notion that the principal's actions of touching Sidney's face were done with something other than his sympathy. The gazes of Sheriff Burke and Dewey imply a possible sexual intention the principal might have for Sidney. Because the overall foundational theme of Scream is based on its sexual implications, it's this possibility of the principal's sexual intention that brings Ghostface to murder him later on. Because why, really, should the principal be killed? He doesn't know any special information he could give to the police. He doesn't stand in the way of Ghostface from raining havoc on the town. And the 2 students who are acting like fools dressed as Ghostface were irrelevant red herrings. They weren't the killers and had no ill will towards the principal. The murder of the principal is symbolic of the central theme. Scream holds its characters responsible for even remotely suggesting sexual desires in a negative manner, even if judged by another character. If the principal hadn't touched Sidney's face, the principal would have been irrelevant and would have never encountered Ghostface. But because the principal dies, the movie suggests that the principal did, indeed, touch Sidney's face with sexual intentions.
I know what. I think it's time you got over that. I mean, when my mom left my dad, I accepted it. It's the way it is.
After Sidney is attacked by Ghostface and Billy is arrested, we next see them together arguing in school.
I am sorry if my traumatized life is an inconvenience to you and your perfect existence.
This is the first time we get some backstory into Billy's character and his reasoning behind why he does what he does. He mentions that Sidney should get over her grief from her mother's death because he accepted that his mother left his father. Although Sidney gets mad and runs away, it's this conversation that changes her mind about sleeping with Billy. It appears as if he's over his parents' separation by the way he seems to easily glaze over it, but we know from what he confesses at the end that it's his entire motivation. This scene is clever because it touches on Billy's backstory without it being spotlighted. He makes it seem like his mother just left for reasons unknown, much like irreconcilable differences were checked off on divorce paperwork. His parents divorced because his father was having an affair with Sydney's mother. Billy's father was involved in the theme of sexual promiscuity that the others go through and die from in the movie. However, Billy's father doesn't suffer the same deadly consequences as the others because Billy wasn't going to kill his father, even though his father was directly involved in the situation that kickstarted the entire sexual promiscuity theme and broke up Billy's family. Billy's father is just as responsible as Sydney's mother, but Billy doesn't hold his dad to the same accountability. Perhaps the murder of Billy's father would have been too revealing to the audience that Billy and his family were involved in Sydney's story, so it was cleverly left out. Behind Sydney on the wall is a large mother-daughter breakfast banner sponsored by the varsity cheerleaders. It makes it look like the cheerleaders have good intentions when it comes to celebrating mothers and their daughters, but they really don't, as we'll see soon. That banner is there to make the cheerleaders look sympathetic and to remind the audience that the death of Sydney's mother is forever present. When Sydney retreats to the girls' bathroom, she overhears two girls discussing the recent murders, Sydney's attack and her mother's death.
What if she did it? What if Sydney killed Casey and Steve?
A cheerleader, who is at the center of the conversation, speaks ill of Sydney's mother before leaving.
Maybe she's a slut, just like her mother. You're evil.
So the mother-daughter banner is a false sense of sympathy because the cheerleaders have a different opinion behind closed doors. And it also symbolizes Billy's lack of sympathy for Sydney's situation as we see him tell her to get over the death of her murdered mother that he had done himself.
Oh my God, Randy, I thought you were dead.
I probably should be. I never thought I'd be so happy to be a virgin.
We can't go any further without talking about Randy. He's the film buff who somewhat breaks the fourth wall by not only speaking about the rules of horror movies in the film's most famous scene, but covertly gives the audience clues to solve the mystery throughout the story. Randy tells the audience that Billy is the killer.
You're such a little lapdog. He's got killer printed all over his forehead.
But he's ignored because he's the movie geek. He's the only single friend in the bunch and isn't given the same respect. He's a fifth wheel. His lack of female sexual partners amongst the others places him in not just a category of male virgins, but as someone who is not to be taken seriously.
You really put her liver in the mailbox? Because I heard that they found her liver in the mailbox.
And therefore can be bullied for his lack of sexual prowess. The quiet way Randy says that Sydney wouldn't have sex with Billy is very important. He whispers it to Stu, suggesting that Randy knows how important it is.
It's his reason. Maybe Sydney wouldn't have sex with him.
He sees how badly Billy wants to seduce Sydney, but she didn't give in. And it's also a self-aware reference for the audience because they see that Randy's correct, knowing that Billy has tried to bed Sydney, but she's denied him. Randy recognizes that the conflict surrounding Sydney is due to her sexual relationship with Billy. Knowing horror movies the way he does, Randy must see that Sydney represents a virginal innocence and naivety that Billy wants to possess, corrupt, and destroy. Randy even tries to make his argument to Stu that maybe Sydney would date him now. Stu laughs in Randy's face, of course, knowing that Randy will never have a chance with Sydney because he's an awkward movie geek.
Do you think Sid would go out with me?
However, according to the screenplay, Randy asks Sydney on a date at the end of the movie, but that was stripped for the ending we got. While preparing for Stu's big party, Sydney and Tatum go to the local food mart. Just after their discussion of how nervous Sydney gets around Billy when they get sexual, there's a quick reflection of Ghostface in a freezer door to remind the audience that Ghostface is always present because he's waiting for Sydney. This is a reference to Laurie Strode seeing Michael Myers behind the bush and in the yard. Just as it's symbolic to the theme of babysitting responsibility in Halloween, it's a reminder to the audience that Ghostface is present when the conversation about sexual promiscuity comes up, and that Sydney will make a very important decision to have or not have sex with Billy later on. But what's more important is the food in the freezer that blends with Ghostface's reflection. It's for a brand called Romantica. They make ice cream cakes. The reflection of Ghostface in the Romantica boxes are to foreshadow that Billy is the killer. Tatum and Sydney were just having a conversation about Billy and about how their romance together, she feels, is weird. Something isn't right about Billy.
Billy's right, you know. Whenever he touches me, I just can't relax.
In the script, Sydney even confesses to Billy that anytime she gets close to him, she sees her mom. It's almost as if her dead mother, in a supernatural sense, is warning Sydney to stay away from Billy. Sydney knows Billy's wrong for her, but she does not listen to her gut. And this reflection of Ghostface is telling the audience just that. Sydney is correct not to feel normal around Billy, because his romance with her is false. It's tainted with elements of revenge. They could have chosen any other brand, but they decided to use a brand that specifically reflects the distorted romance that Sydney has with Billy.
No, please don't kill me, Mr. Ghostface. I want to be in the sequel.
Tatum is the sister to Dewey, a loyal best friend to Sydney, and a good-hearted person in general. It seems odd that, when applying the sexual promiscuity theme to her character, it makes any relevance, but it does. There's a scene in the script where Tatum discusses her right as a woman to freely speak of a man's penis, because men freely gossip about women's anatomy. This was cut from the movie, and we see the resurgence of that conversation come up later. Stu and Randy make a quick reference to Jamie Lee Curtis's breasts. Tatum notes this to Sydney, calling back to the conversation in the script.
Jamie Lee Curtis is in all of his movies.
With a set of lungs like that, she should be.
Yeah.
Tits. See?
But even by not including Tatum's penis dialogue from the script, the sexual theme still applies to Tatum because of this one shot. When she opens the garage door and her hard nipples are on full display, Tatum now conveys her sexuality in a negative manner. This hypocrisy dooms her. Up until this point in the film, Tatum has been a level-headed, optimistic, and feminist character of the crew.
And the fact is, it takes a man to do something like that.
Or a man's mentality.
She never displayed her sexuality like that. It wasn't in her character, but apparently it was. The one time Tatum does express her sexuality in an obvious and therefore negative manner, Ghostface appears to hold her accountable. Not too much information is given about Kenny, Gale's cameraman. He likes to eat and he's kind of slow when it comes to doing his job. Whereas the other victims of Ghostface spotlight sexuality, Kenny's character doesn't reflect any surface level sexuality at all. But there is one brief moment that can be viewed as sexual on Kenny's part. That's when he eats the single Cheeto with his mouth wide open. It might be a stretch, but it's symbolic of fellatio, and it is likely meant to be taken that way, since this movie is filled with sexual implications, both in its dialogue and its symbolism. And if you don't believe me, ask yourself, what if it were a banana instead of a Cheeto Kenny was eating like that as the camera focused on him? Would that make a difference? Of course it would, but that would be far more obvious of sexual implications, wouldn't it? The way the camera focuses on Kenny during this moment isn't just meant to be comedic by showing that he enjoys playing with his food before he eats it, but it's to imply a homosexual act that will eventually doom his character. John Carpenter's Halloween was a huge influence in the making of Scream. The movie bookends itself with references to Halloween. Casey Becker states that it's her favorite horror film, and then the house party watches Halloween together, as Randy mentions several moments from the movie. And there's a clever reference to Billy being the killer, because of the blood splattered over Sydney during Billy's fake death. During the Halloween scene, one of the guys say that the blood is too red to be believable. In the script, Sydney, when running away from Ghostface in the attic after Billy's staged death, sees herself in the mirror, noting that Billy's blood on her doesn't look right.
Corn syrup. Same stuff they use for pig's blood in Carrie.
Not in my movie.
Whereas other characters are held responsible for their sexual acts and sexual suggestions in Scream, Sydney is not, and we'll find out why right now. But let's discuss the moments leading up to her losing her virginity first. Sydney's choice to sleep with Billy can be traced back to several instances. First was when she bumped into him in the hallway. Billy guilt trips her by noting that she hasn't gotten over her mother's death.
It's been a year.
Tomorrow. 1 year tomorrow.
I know what, I think it's time you got over that.
While this is insensitive, it actually plants the seed for changing Sydney's mind to sleep with him. Sydney brings this up with Tatum at the food mart, acknowledging that she doesn't feel right when she's alone with Billy.
Billy's right, you know. Whenever he touches me, I just can't relax. So you have a few intimacy issues as a result of your mother's untimely death.
This all plays into Billy's favor. Billy is then viewed as simply a guy who wants to have sex with a girl he genuinely likes, rather than stealing her virginity for the sake of sexual conquest. When Billy appears in the doorway after killing Tatum, Sydney immediately takes him upstairs, suggesting her dominance in the situation and her leadership in choosing to have sex with Billy. She's very inviting to him. She's not standoffish or threatened by his sudden presence like she had been. Sydney, at this point, is ready to have sex with Billy. She's made up her mind. Billy goes into apology mode because he knows it will make him appear like the good guy who's sensitive to her feelings.
I've been selfish, and I want to apologize.
It's a fake apology, but Sydney is so focused on overcoming her mother's death that she doesn't see it. Sydney mentions her mother and how she's worried that she'll turn out just like her, a woman obsessed with sex to the point she'll have casual sex and mess up her life because of it. And that's exactly what she does anyway.
Yeah, I think I'm really scared that I'm gonna turn out just like her, you know?
Sydney is so caught up on not being her mother and forgiving Billy that she falls right into Billy's plot to have sex with her while also becoming a promiscuous woman like her mother. She's no different in that regard.
That's right. You gave it up. Now you're no longer a virgin.
We did your mom a favor, Sid. That woman was a slutbag whore who flashed her shit all over town like she was Sharon Stone or something.
Sydney is a very tragic character and probably the most well-written final girl in any horror movie. Although Sydney fights back from her Ghostface attacks and is a strong character because of her ability to endure her suffering, the movie still portrays Sydney as naive when it comes to not being able to see who has bad intentions towards her. Ironically, the only thing that saves Sydney is that same naive characteristic. She was manipulated throughout the whole movie, and because of that manipulation, the story pities her. She's had a bad feeling about Billy the entire time, and she still chooses to go against her instinct and have sex with him. It's this pity and compassion that saves her from death. All other characters who express sexuality in a perverted form were killed off, but not the woman who has had sex with the killer, which in a weird way serves as Sydney's saving grace.
Certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex.
Scream is a sexually charged story that spotlights the repercussions of promiscuous sex. Randy's speech, where he discusses the rules of successfully surviving a horror movie, should be taken as metatextual, like everything else in Scream, primarily because of the story's main message to its audience. Each character who dies expresses sexuality in a negative way, and that's what the Ghostface mask mocks. Its stunned expression is an insult to its victims for thinking they could get away with their sexual intentions. Using Randy's first rule, let's see who survived. Gail, Sydney, Dewey, and Randy. Randy's survival is simple. He lives on because he's a virgin. He even states this, noting that his virginity didn't curse him and get him killed. Randy never comes face to face with the Ghostface mask, nor does Gail. They both encounter Billy and Stu once revealed as the killers, so the sexual promiscuity theme doesn't apply then, because they were interacting with the actual human form of the killers and not the symbol. Dewey, in the script, was supposed to die in the doorway. However, changes at the last minute were made to have Dewey survive his wounds.
Sydney?
We already know why Sydney survives. Although she broke the cardinal rule and had casual sex with Billy, she was tricked into it, so the movie forgives her. And Gail, as manipulative and amoral as she is never portrayed in the film to be explicitly sexual to the point that it warrants death. She flirts and even kisses Dewey, but it's done playfully to gather information, and it's done sincerely with Dewey, who is naive, brave, and kind-hearted. And technically, Sydney's father survives as well, but he was saved for last, as Billy and Stu were going to use him as the scapegoat for the murders and then would have been framed to commit suicide. So what's the message in Scream about? Well, what happens to the characters that express sexuality as a negative? And by negative, I mean as blatantly suggestive or as casual sex. You have to go to the root cause. The originators, Billy's father and Sydney's mother, are the blueprint for what not to do. Their adulterous affair kickstarted the promiscuous theme that the others either suffered from or willfully engaged in, sending Ghostface to serve as a symbolic consequence to people who treat sex as nothing more than simple hookups or suggestive demonstrations. Scream implies to its audience that maintaining self-control over one's negative sexual expression and by resisting casual sex will keep themselves and others away from ridicule, harm, and death.